So hello, and thank you for taking the time to view this recording of our roundtable. I'm Charlotte Waters, and I'll be moderating this discussion on getting neuroinclusion in the workplace right from the start. And with me today are three experts with different perspectives. Kate, starting with you, could you introduce yourself and give us some background?
Yeah, of course. I'm Kate Rigby, HR Director at Loch HR. I've worked in senior people management and HR roles across a number of sectors, including financial services, professional services, and more latterly in education over the last 20 years. At Loch HR, we typically support and provide HR consultancy and guidance to businesses with anywhere between 10 and 250 employees, regarding all aspects of the employee life cycle, and essentially support clients to have a positive and encouraging workplace culture.
Great, thank you. Pam, if we can come to you.
Hi, thanks, Charlotte. Well, I'm Pam Loch, and I set up Loch in 2007, principally because I'd been specialising in employment law as a solicitor since the 90s, and I was keen to help businesses really do the right thing and minimise risk of claims that arise from not getting it right. And one of the things that I've really been focused on, probably in the last 10 years, is neuroinclusion and diversity, and ensuring that businesses get that right and really benefit from doing so.
Thank you. Susie, perhaps we can come to you now.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Susie Phillips-Baker. I'm currently Chief Psychologist at Lexxic. So Lexxic is a neurodiversity consultancy. We specialise in supporting adults who are neurodivergent in the workplace. So that's all things from assessment through to coaching, and also work with organisations to help them to be more neuro-inclusive. So very relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm a chartered occupational psychologist. So I work really as a kind of a consultant, supporting organisations, supporting individuals, really passionate about neurodiversity. I did actually have my own late life diagnosis a couple of years ago. So I'm neurodivergent myself, which kind of explains why I was attracted to working to this environment in the first place, I think. But yeah, just really happy to be here. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for that. And just then, I think maybe to get us underway, perhaps, Susie, if you could talk us through your thoughts and experiences on why having a management process on neuroinclusion in place can be really valuable in a workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to start there, because I think it's management is often the role and the level of the organisation that is supporting the individuals who are neurodivergent. And I think sometimes there are those roles that are the kind of increased pressure is on those individuals to really kind of understand and support the individuals, and to understand what it is that they need to do, and to be armed and supported to know what kind of level of support is required, and also what's required under the law as well, which I think we'll dig into. But I think when we think about neurodiversity or individuals who are neurodivergent, sometimes issues and challenges can arise for those individuals in the workplace. And sometimes it's only later on, when that's already occurred and when those challenges have built up, that those individuals come to our attention. And certainly as an organisation, we do find that, and that unfortunately, if issues had been maybe tackled earlier on, those challenges wouldn't maybe have got to the point that they're at. So I think that's where we really come at, when we work with organisations, work with individuals, is trying to get things in place quite early on, rather than waiting until things build up. And certainly supporting managers is really important to that as well. We talk about neuroinclusion as a way of kind of creating an environment to be more understanding of neurodiversity and understanding of how we all think differently. And actually that brings a lot of strengths. So I think it's quite important today to also not talk about challenges always, but also think about some of the strengths around neurodiversity as well.
Certainly. And I think you touched on it briefly in that having something in place before it's necessarily needed can be valuable. I don't know if there's anything in addition to that.
Well, that's it, exactly. And I think rather than waiting until issues and challenges occur, that we want to make sure that we're creating the environment for people to thrive, and understanding more about themselves and what might help them. Historically, I think in this field, sometimes we used to find that a lot of the pressure was on the individual who's neurodivergent. Whereas now I think, we understand as organisations that we have a responsibility and a duty of care. But also in organisations, we want to be able to create those environments for people to thrive, as I said. So it's that kind of two-way street. So it's the individual understanding more about themselves, but also the organisation, and then coming together. And if we can do that and we can create that environment and we can set people up for success quite early on in their careers or in their roles in the organisation, then that's obviously going to have a positive impact later on as well.
Kate, from your experience, is it typically something that you see in place at early stages of organisations?
I think people, companies, from what we're seeing, are definitely moving more towards that being a more inclusive, or having more inclusive practices and processes from the outset. Totally echo what Susie's saying about obviously having things in place earlier at the outset, obviously can potentially proactively avoid potential issues later down the line. From my perspective and from our perspective, what we see, it's really important to be neuro-inclusive and have processes that are neuro-inclusive to create a really positive workplace culture to enable all your teams to be effective, really effective and creative. And from us, it's very much about looking at all processes across the employee life cycle. So starting right at the recruitment process. So thinking about how can we be inclusive as part of the recruitment process to make sure we're really bringing out people's strengths at that stage to make sure whether they are really the right fit for this organisation. And then once they are onboarded, making sure that the induction and onboarding process is also really inclusive, performance management process is really inclusive and creates, an environment where anybody, but anybody with particularly a neurodivergent diagnosis to be successful. And as Susie mentioned, I think, and hopefully I think we'll touch on this quite a bit over the next half an hour, 45 minutes, about them being able to thrive and focus on their strengths and being able to thrive in the workplace environment. So yes, I think in conclusion to your question, I think it's becoming more and more on the agenda of organisations to get the kind of processes in place, which I think is a really positive step forward.
Pam, I guess coming to you in terms of an employment law perspective about having decisions and parameters and processes put in place before it's needed is also a huge reflection of people's requirements and responsibilities. Perhaps you could talk a bit about, from a legal perspective, what that might.
Yeah, certainly. I think there's no doubt the impact the Equality Act is having on the way that businesses are approaching things, which it's a shame it takes a piece of legislation to sort of compel people to look at their processes. But if that has a positive outcome for people that are neurodivergent, then great. I think the challenge is there's a myth out there that if someone has a neurodivergent condition, that it automatically means they've got a disability under the Equality Act. And that's not quite correct. They may well qualify as being disabled, but they have to meet the requirements of the definition under the legislation, which means that they've got to have a condition which has a substantial adverse effect on their day-to-day activities, and that's normal day-to-day activities, which is long-lasting or could recur, but it's certainly got to last for longer than 12 months. Now, quite often, neurodivergent conditions may well fall into that, so I think employers need to be very cautious about how they approach it. But I'm a big advocate of approach it as something you should be doing for any employee who may need an adjustment to their workplace. Don't do it just because the law says you need to do it. If you've got an employee that needs an adjustment made that would enable them to really perform well and be productive and effective in what they're doing, then that's got to be a win for you as an employer as well. So I'm a great believer in actually think about adjustments you can make rather than waiting for the law to force you to make them. But certainly the biggest challenge we see at the moment is quite often employers are not finding out about someone being neurodivergent until something goes wrong. And this is what I think Susie was referring to, and Kate as well. And that's always a bit sad, because at that stage, sometimes the relationship may well have broken down. There's a degree of cynicism, I think, with employers, because perhaps they've got a performance issue, or there's, as I had today, a conduct issue that's been raised, and the person is now saying that they have ADHD, for example, and that's sort of put forward as an explanation, as or a justification, or a way of sort of avoiding getting into trouble, if you want to use that phrase. So the employer is almost waiting for someone to say, well, I've got this diagnosis, whereas actually, if you have that diagnosis, as Kate was saying, it's best if the employer knows first, because the employer can then work with you to really make sure you can do the job, and there's not going to be issues arise later. But that is the biggest challenge at the moment, I think, is that people are also self-diagnosing, because although there is the facilities, there are facilities there privately. Often people can't afford the private fees, but it also puts the employer a bit on the back foot when they've got somebody saying, well, I'm self-diagnosing as being ADHD, and the employer's like, well, what do I do now? So I think for me, obviously, it's a challenging time in the NHS for people to get diagnosed, but if there was a quicker way or a better way to help facilitate diagnosis at an earlier stage and someone actually tells their employer or prospective employer that they have this condition, well, I say condition, they are different, then the employer can then make adjustments to the job or consider what adjustments could be made. And just to, I don't want to obviously hog this all, but just to sort of make a point there as well, I think it's important to make the adjustments, but there are some jobs where you just cannot accommodate someone's condition. And that doesn't have to be neurodiversity, it could be something else. And therefore it may well be they're just not in the right job. And actually, thinking about, are they in the right job that's actually going to make them feel happy and thrive in the job they're doing, I think is really important as well. So sometimes it's a two-way thing, obviously. If you apply for a job, is it going to be a suitable job for you? Are you going to be happy in it? I think it's important to think about that all the way through your career. If you get, a diagnosis later on, and it actually may explain why you're not enjoying what you're doing, because actually you're just not right for that job, you're never going to be happy in that job. And to me, life is so short, you need to try and think about, actually, am I in the right job? Is it going to make me really enjoy what I'm doing? And that's aside from the legal obligations. I think there's a different aspect there that we all have to take our own responsibility for as well.
So it brings up an interesting kind of discussion around the kind of legal requirements versus a kind of duty of care, not only to ourselves as individual, a duty of care, but also, for people that we're looking after. I guess there's a kind of question around the disclosure of information. At what point does that feel like it's the right time to do that? Does that vary for different people, or does that somehow impact the ongoing relationship? I don't know if Susie, Kate, if you've got thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. Sorry, Kate, just going to jump in there. Yeah, I do a lot of thoughts on that. And I think the word disclosure, disclosure is a word that some people don't like, that they prefer to use the term share. I think language is something that's really important, and we can dig into that a little bit. But yeah, I think in terms of when, I would always say it's very much up to the individual in terms of when they choose to talk to their employer about their diagnosis or what they suspect they might have. And I think what an employer can helpfully do is explain what the benefits are of telling them more information. And if they do know, then they can provide support to them. So therefore, if they're open about what adjustments they've perhaps provided for other people, or they're sharing case studies and examples of, positive stories of people in their organization, and if they've got leaders who are willing to put up their hands and say, actually, I'm neurodivergent and I'm in a senior position in this organization, and they have power. So there's lots of ways that an organization can signal positive, but that does not mean that an individual is always going to be open and honest. And that is absolutely up to them. That's very much personal choice. And I would never, suggest that an organization should, enforce or in some way make people, I'm sure they absolutely can't legally anyway, but they definitely, shouldn't be made to explain. But again, if you, put the positive side across, and that's going to potentially help those individuals. And equally, it doesn't need to be a conversation about neurodiversity. So it doesn't have to be, let's sit down and talk about your autism. It's like, let's sit down and talk about what we can do to support you in your role to be the best person you can be. What is it that's going to help you? And that's the same for all of us. So we all have things that we need support around, things that we're good at, things that we're less good at. So actually, if we can have a conversation and it's more in that kind of sphere, then that's still going to be very helpful. But it doesn't have to fall into the kind of bucket of, I need special assistance or support. And as Pam mentioned, some people may not fall into technically, kind of category of disabled under the law, and potentially depending on the nature of their difficulties that they're experiencing. But equally, they might not identify as disabled. So a lot of people who are neurodivergent don't identify with that label and wouldn't feel comfortable with that. So therefore, if we're saying, for example, with recruitment, if you are covered under the law as having a disability, please let us know and we'll provide reasonable adjustments. Well, if I'm neurodivergent and don't consider myself to be disabled, I won't think that relates to me. So I might not ask. Whereas if we say, is there anything we can do to support you to be your best in the interview or in the assessment process, let us know. Then there's a different way of phrasing it, and that might open up that conversation about disclosure as well. Kate, I'm sure you probably want to.
Yeah. Totally agree with everything you just said there, Susie. I think the most important thing for an employer can do is really create a culture of psychological safety within a workplace, so that basically your employees feel safe to disclose where they want to. They feel safe to disclose that they have a neurodivergent diagnosis. And in that case, that enables and that gives the employer the opportunity to ensure that the right recruitment, assessment or induction or management processes are put in place to accommodate those employees. But also, I think we've touched on earlier on, it might have been Pam that mentioned it earlier on, about some neurodivergent employees may not actually know that they have a neurodivergent condition. And that's where I think it's even more important to create a work environment where all employees are accepted. We're talking about and focusing on employee strengths and creating an environment to support those strengths. So regardless of whether they have a neurodivergent diagnosis or not, but I think it's all about creating that kind of positive, workplace environment where they feel safe. And I think, identifying potentially you've got somebody who's a senior member of staff on the SLT, for example, who then kind of tells the team that they have got a neurodivergent condition, can start to move towards creating that environment. But also, I think the other thing that's really important is being able to disclose without the fear of judgment. So, creating that environment where somebody might disclose to their line manager they have a neurodivergent diagnosis and not worrying that there's going to be any judgment there. I think that's really important. I'm sure we'll touch on this later on, but for me, what I see with the clients that we work with, the ones that are most successful, it's where the line management are trained and skilled to manage employees with neurodivergent diagnoses. So I think that's something I'm sure we'll touch on later on. But I think for me, it's just about creating the environment to enable people to want to disclose, because as you rightly say, we can't force them.
And from a from a legal standpoint, Pam, as an employer, what are your rights around asking for or requesting even somebody to seek a diagnosis?
Well, there's a couple of different angles there. Many years ago, we used to be able to have these things called medical questionnaires, where you used to be able to ask any questions that you wanted to before you recruited somebody. And fortunately, legislation changed that. But there's still certain occupations where it would be justified to have a pre-medical questionnaire completed. For example, airline pilots. So there are some occupations where it may be legitimate to request if someone has a diagnosis of a neurodivergent condition, but that's very limited. So I suppose at the outset, what you want to do is encourage people, as Kate and Susie were saying, really to be open about any conditions, any requirements that they may have, because that will help. I mean, I've had situations where, had the recruitment process been adjusted, the person would have got a job. And of course, they didn't get the job, and then they challenged it later. And of course, they would then have been successful. They brought a claim against the employer because the recruitment process itself was not favourable or helpful to someone who was neurodivergent. Once into employment, again, there is not an obligation, a legal obligation to disclose, and you don't really have. If you ask a question, you have to be very careful about how you then handle the situation, because if somebody, for example, discloses a neurodivergent, and then they feel they've been discriminated against, then obviously it could bring claims against you equally. I think employers have to be careful about having their own sort of thoughts on somebody, for example, being on the spectrum or having some other condition, but actually they're incorrect in that assessment as well. Or they may be correct, but they treat the person in a different way. So again, there's a potential for victimisation, discrimination claims, harassment claims as well. And we know there's quite a lot of claims that are coming forward as a result of that. So one of the key things, as Kate alluded to, or in fact mentioned, was you need to train managers. We need to educate the team. It's not just about somebody disclosing and you having that information. It's about what you do with that information. How do the team behave around the person? How do they operate? How do they engage? How do they interact? Train the managers so that they can also then, obviously, absolutely critical, because we know that that's one of the reasons why people leave jobs, because of the way they've been managed. But it also leaves the business exposed to quite significant risk if the managers don't handle the situation particularly well. And one of the things that often gets forgotten, and we're talking about in this scenario where someone's been subjected to discrimination because they may have a disability under the Quality Act, people forget that individuals can be liable as well for discrimination claims. So the managers themselves could be liable. So it's in everybody's interest to be educated. Having said all of that, I have had scenarios where the client has gone above and beyond to make adjustments to facilitate someone in the workplace because they have a neurodivergent diagnosis, only for the person to say that they want them to forget what they've been told. In other words, unhear everything they've heard about them being neurodivergent, because they didn't like the idea that they were being different and treated differently. So it's a tricky situation sometimes, but that's where the law then obviously kicks in, because if someone has got a disability, then you are under a legal obligation to make reasonable adjustments to enable them to carry out their role in the workplace.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add on those aspects of that part of the conversation. Anything that you feel wasn't fully addressed?
Well, no, nothing not fully addressed. So interesting. Just just the education piece I think is really interesting. A couple of thoughts that came to my mind. One of them was that we are hearing a lot more about neurodiversity these days. Certainly my algorithms, they're probably a bit skewed, but I'm hearing and seeing lots of different neurodiversity popping up every time I open my browser. So people are hearing and experiencing more information, and I think sometimes that can lead to a lot of well-meaning intention on people to help. And I get this question a lot when we do sessions of people saying, what if I think somebody in my team is neurodivergent? What should I do? Should I tell them, or should I, and I always would caution that. And I think, Pam, you were really kind of, alluding to that as well, is that, it's not for the manager. The awareness and education is not because so that a manager can then start diagnosing or start giving people help where they think they should have it. It's really just to arm people to feel confident to have conversations. So that's for me the key thing about supporting managers. It's not about saying you should know everything about neurodiversity and all of the conditions and know what the traits are and start being able to label people. Definitely not. But what is really helpful is to enable your managers and your teams to feel confident to have a conversation and to say, it's okay if somebody starts telling you something that they're experiencing, to say, well, I don't know anything about that. Like, tell me a bit more. What's your experience? And I think when it comes to neurodiversity, our experience in the world is so unique, as in all of us, we all have different experiences and perspectives. And so I would never assume that I understand the experience of someone else who has the same diagnosis as me, for example. Actually, their experience could be very, very different. So I think that was just something I just wanted to bring out in terms of education. What are we educating? It's not necessarily just what is neurodiversity and what are the categories, but more how to just have an open and comfortable conversation with somebody about what makes them different, what makes them think differently, what perspective do they bring, and how can we kind of create that conversation.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I think that's where I think we want to talk to employees about their strengths and like you say, how they see things and their experiences, particularly if a manager, for example, thinks they might have a neurodivergent condition but they haven't disclosed it. It might be exactly as we were talking about before, they might not actually know, or it might not be that at all, but it's just creating a working culture, workplace culture and a work environment to talk about strengths, perspectives, kind of bring all those together, seeing different perspectives so that all employees can thrive within the workplace.
I think if we're looking from the perspective of the benefits, I think then being able to share an experience or a diagnosis or a personal suspicion or whatever you have with a team. But I guess that's not always going to be possible. And then how does that get managed then within an organisation? Because there will be people who don't want to share their situation or don't feel comfortable doing that. And yet then there are other team members who are interacting with an individual and perhaps drawing their own conclusions or maybe even making accusations about it. I don't know what people's experience of that have been. Perhaps, Susie, there might be something from you.
Just from a practical perspective, I certainly, have examples of that coming to me and work that we've done over the years. And I think it's enabling those conversations for the manager. And again, it's the kind of the manager may need support around how to create an environment within their team, which is neuro-inclusive. And back to that word that we started with, how to be more neuro-inclusive. And sometimes if an individual has been open with the manager and told them and asked for support, and the manager's given support, but that individual doesn't want to be open with the rest of the team, that can actually cause a bit of an issue for the manager, because they're then in this situation where they've and people can accuse them of being of kind of favoritism, and you're giving this person all this support and I've not got this. So that can cause a lot of challenges. We do coaching for line managers. So actually the managers themselves can sometimes just need that support. So not necessarily always just focusing in on the individual. And when we're supporting line managers, we're not supporting them by talking about the person they're managing and saying, this is all the things you can do for them. I'll often say, how is it for you? You know, what's going on for you and what support do you need? Because it's really tough. You know, it's tough being a manager anyway. We're very complicated humans. We create all the problems in organizations often. And I think, you know, for managers, they can often be that individual who's kind of, you know, in this position where they really want to be helpful. And as Pam said, there's, you know, that example, and I've heard of those before, where the company or the organization has given everything they possibly can to support the individual, and they've really done everything. The manager's working overtime and everything to kind of support the individual, and it's maybe just doesn't feel like it's quite enough, or maybe it's not pushing them past that point of success within that role. And back to that, is this the right role for them conversation? And I think sometimes opening up conversations and having support in place for people to hopefully come to that realization for themselves can be helpful. So I'm not sure I answered that fully. I think I went around in a circle a little bit. But...
That's right. It's all good information. I think your point about, you know, bringing it back to the kind of subject of, you know, neuro getting it right from the start. Kate, I wonder if you could add some thoughts around, obviously, you know, that starts from, I'm presuming, from recruitment, from that point onwards, or does it start even earlier than that?
Well, I think realistically for employers, I think it starts from the, you know, attraction, recruit, being really clear about what the role is, being clear about what the expectations are of the role are. When you're thinking about the recruitment process, thinking about what the appropriate tasks are during the recruitment process. So, for example, if somebody discloses potentially that they had a neurodiverse diagnosis at the outset and they would like to have the interview questions ahead, is it appropriate for that particular role to get the interview questions if that's going to help and support that individual to be the best that they can be and to demonstrate their skill set during the interview process? I mean, we did have a role with a client of ours quite recently where they were recruiting for a data analyst, and there was a number of candidates of which one disclosed and felt comfortable, which is really positive, and that they had I think it was ADHD right at the outset. And so during the process, their text, or it might have been ASD actually, but they had their technical skill set was the strongest of the candidates, but their interpersonal skill set wasn't as strong. So actually what they then did was the assessment process was just reviewed at the start of that to make sure that they were fairly assessing for the role that they were recruiting for and testing the actual skill set that they needed, rather than typically I'm going to interview this person and make an assessment based on the interview. The whole assessment process was looked at, and as a result they might have not had the strongest interpersonal skills, but they were deemed to be the strongest fit for the role and actually were successful in getting that role. And so I think that's an example of right role, right fit. And I think, as Pam was saying earlier, some roles, it might be that person really isn't the right fit for that particular role, and actually having the really strong and the right recruitment process for each and every role individually will identify that early on, which then hopefully will mean you've got the right person and ultimately avoid potential issues later down the line or minimize the risk of those potential issues later down the line. So I think, it starts right at the attraction and the early recruitment stages.
And it certainly would then open up a quite obvious route into performance management and appraisals and being able to benefit the manager as well, because that's all out in the open and clear and everybody feels comfortable.
Yeah, I think it's from the performance management perspective, I think it's really important to be really clear at the outset again what the performance management process is, what the expectations are really early on in the employee onboarding experience. So what are the expectations of that individual in the role, so that there is no surprises. They are clear about what the measurements are, what the expectations and what the KPIs of that particular role are. So again, to make it a smoother and easier process throughout induction, probation, and then ultimately performance management moving down the line.
And I think your point previously, Susie, about having figureheads within an organisation that can talk about their own experiences or just talk about how the business, the organisation supports people generally, makes that a much more free and easy, obvious starting point. Yeah. I don't know.
I think it's also important. I was going to say, just to talk about, it's not a one size fits all, which I think is what we've sort of been talking about. But I think it's important to maybe just look at that as well, because I think that's a challenge when we're talking about people who are neurodivergent. And I think different diagnoses obviously mean that people operate in different ways, but also within a particular condition. So as someone who is ADHD, there'll be certain traits, if you want to call it that, but how you operate with a person is not just it's not just the same way with everybody. So I think it's really important to think about that, because again, when you're looking at adjustments, that's something that you need to keep in mind. It's got to be a reasonable adjustment to enable that person to do the job as well. So I think that's something else that really needs to be drilled down and just managers understand. And as Susie was saying, it is difficult to manage. I think one of the things that we're finding is that managers are being subjected to upward bullying sometimes, because they are trying their best to try and manage a situation, but actually the person that they're managing is bullying them in the process, and it becomes much more difficult to then function. And we're seeing quite a lot of managers going off sick with anxiety and other conditions as a result of trying to manage. And I think we've got to be honest, it is sometimes more difficult. I mean, I have personal experience of someone who is neurodivergent, and they were probably unaware of the way certain things that they do, which needs an adjustment in a personal relationship. But in the workplace, it's even more challenging, because obviously you can't, unless you've got a great relationship with somebody, you're not going to have that sort of the same open and honest relationship as you would in a personal relationship quite often. So it's very difficult for managers to get it right. And just because they don't get it right all the time isn't wrong. It's just got to learn. But there has to be some leeway for them to sort of make mistakes and learn from the mistakes. So I think it's a two-way process, as I said earlier. It's not just all about the managers learning and the manager. It's the people working together, everybody working as a team, to really have a thriving community and workplace that everybody really benefits from.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and it brings to my mind two people with the same diagnosis in different jobs will need different reasonable adjustments. So there isn't a list and go, yeah, I need this, and then if they transfer to another role or go somewhere else, they might need different things, and their coping strategies might also break down. So sometimes what we find is people moving into more senior positions. I mean, you're neurodivergent and you've kind of managed quite well for most of your career. Suddenly you're in a leadership position where you're managing a team of people. That can break down some of those coping strategies, and that can prove quite challenging. And if you're in an environment where you're not necessarily feeling it's very inclusive, or you're not feeling that you're comfortable enough to share, then that can really put a lot of pressure. And the other thing I wanted to mention as well is that there's often a correlation with mental health challenges with neurodiversity. So we often will see some mental health challenges like depression or anxiety, which are not caused by the neurodiversity, but maybe also occurring at the same time. And that in itself can obviously cause additional challenges for people. And you're right, Pam, that some of those challenges can be of the manager from the individual. And it could be that individual trying to exercise control of their own situation. And it could be that they've had a lot of bad experiences, or it could be that they're just trying to really get by and be okay and get through their day. But actually, the way that they do that is potentially quite negative, and it's having a negative impact on others around. So it's really important to highlight that and not just say, oh, it's all on the manager to put all of this in place, when actually, there can be some challenges for them too. It's a good point.
And it may, as you say, it may not be a deliberate act by the person to bully, but what the effect is, it comes across as the person's feeling bullied. I mean, I've seen situations where, there's very, very, very detailed, long, probably assisted by ChatGPT emails going to the managers, very challenging their language, very aggressive sometimes. And it may well be that's the way that the person is communicating, as you say, to sort of either get some control of the situation themselves, or because they feel frustrated because they don't think people are listening to them. But the perception of that and the impact on the manager is quite significant. And there's a fixation with their position where the manager might be managing 20, 30 people, and they've got this one person that's fixated on their situation, understandably, because they want it resolved. The challenge we've got as a solicitor and advising the situation is we've then got a number of different dynamics coming into play here in terms of the manager's duty, the duty of care that the employer owes to the manager. and obviously duty of care and legal obligations to the other person as well. And I think it's very difficult when the employer gets caught up in the middle of that situation. And I think at the moment, because there are so many people being diagnosed and they haven't told the employer at the outset, and suddenly it just becomes a diagnosis, potentially self-diagnosed, at a point at which there's some challenging environment that the employer's facing, then there is this cynicism that is creeping in, much in the same ways we have with mental ill health. And, we've seen cases where employers and individuals have been found to have discriminated against someone who's neurodivergent because they sort of make some comments, or even just raising their eyebrows at it, as if to say, or making some sort of noise. So, it is a difficult situation that employers are in. But I think if they can get it right from the outset and actually embrace neuroinclusion and be open about it on websites, but don't put it on your website unless you mean it, because that will fall apart. But if you actually do want to have and offer a neuro-inclusive environment, shout about it from the outset on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on your website. So you're going to attract people that are going to be open and honest about it at the outset, hopefully. But even if they don't, keep an open mind about it. Don't assume that somebody is just bringing this up because actually they're trying as a way to get out or to explain why they behaved in a particular way that's maybe not been appropriate in the circumstances.
I think that's all. It's all about the culture that you want to create, and exactly what you were just saying, Pam. It's a really interesting point, which is obviously, yes, shout about it, and that's great, but then only shout about it if you are going to be able to do it, because the worst thing you can do is to your culture is to say that you're going to do something and actually then you don't do it. That then has the adverse effect. So I think just kind of eking on from what you were just saying is very much about really genuinely creating that positive workplace culture which would embrace neuroinclusive.
I think we, to come to understand it's a personal, individual experience of a condition, and then, to look at some of the aspects of work that might be impacting that or impacted by that. I think we've talked about some of the elements of psychological safety and some of the kind of adjustments, but I know that there's thoughts around different work styles, people being in offices, not being offices. And I know, given that it's potentially quite a long and broad list, I don't know if there are elements that we've not yet touched on that might help employers to consider the way that they're working and to offer up options for people that would work better for them. Either that is around team structure or workplace participation or other types of training. What other things do you think perhaps people should be considering?
Shall I go first, Charlotte? I think you touched on training. I think it's important to basically offer training to, yes, I think line managers, it's really important. And I think it's really key that line managers are given the opportunity to undertake training. They have the right skill set to manage and support for when things perhaps are a little bit more challenging. So where do they go if they're a bit like what Pam was saying, they're in a situation they don't really know how to handle it? Where do they go for that? And making sure that there is kind of an infrastructure to support that. But I think also that it's important to kind of have policies in terms of possibly training the team members on different types of neurodivergent diagnoses, and also kind of busting any myths that might be there, just trying to create with the whole team a really inclusive environment. And we've seen that. I mean, I've seen that with a client relatively recently who offers an internship program for working with a local college for students that have ASD. And as a result of that, they've made various adjustments to support them during that program, but also very much so the line managers are super supported and trained in terms of making adjustments and supporting that whole employee lifecycle process through the program. But also the team also have training in terms of supporting that individual and inclusivity around that individual as well. So that's been really successful. And it's kind of because it's kind of managed throughout the whole process, including line management support, but also team training as well. So they have an understanding of how to support the individual and encourage an inclusive workplace.
Susie, what would your thoughts be on other ways that employers could consider being supportive and benefiting?
Yeah, so from the individual level, I think, based on some of what we're talking about, getting some kind of objective information to support around those conversations. So maybe a workplace needs assessment. So having, kind of breaking down some of those kind of perspectives. If you've got the individual's view and you've got the line manager's view and the organisation, it can get quite complicated and tricky. So is there some kind of objective information that you could bring in as well to understand what are the actual nature of the difficulties this person is experiencing in their role, and what are the things that the organisation can do to support them. And so that's one way of kind of really trying to get underneath some of the challenges. And also coaching is really, really effective way of supporting individuals to explore ways to empower them to kind of seek out what they can do for themselves. Reasonable adjustments don't always have to be expensive. They don't always have to be big. It can be little tweaks that you're making to your day. There's lots of strategies out there, you can get access to yourself if you do some research, but equally the specialists out there, obviously like ourselves, that we can kind of provide guidance around that. And the other thing we do is we do audits, so we can look at an organisation and help them to understand how neuro-inclusive are you currently in your recruitment, in your performance management. And some of the challenges around kind of performance management, we talked about really good, good practice. Generally, a lot of what we're talking about is probably just good practice anyway, in terms of business. But, when it comes to individuals who are neurodivergent, sometimes feedback can be really, really challenging. So people can have a very strong adverse reaction to any form of perceived criticism. And that in itself can be really difficult to manage for them, as well as for the manager and for the organisation. And that is really key when it comes to tracking, managing performance, and giving people information that they need to be able to improve or to be able to do their job as best as they can. So there's lots of kind of additional complexity there, as well as having a good process in place. It's like, well, how do we actually manage the response to that? So there's things that you can do from an organisational level to understand how are your processes actually impacting on people as individuals. So just a couple of other things to think about there.
Great, thank you. And I think to sum up and to wrap up, I think perhaps we should think about, the ways in which it's beneficial to have a broad base, of differing minds and differing thoughts in organisations, and what the value of that is. Perhaps, Susie, that might be one for you to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there is evidence around that from a lot of organisations. Kate said, some people being proactively kind of attracting individuals who are neurodivergent. And I've heard of lots of organisations like GCHQ who are doing a proactive recruitment for people who are dyslexic, because they're recognising the positive benefits that can bring to the specific roles like coding and things like that. So actually, there's evidence to suggest that diversity is beneficial to a business, to their organisation, to your ability to manage in our very turbulent times. And we need to be constantly flexing and changing at the moment. So neurodiversity for me is your competitive edge. And it's just about getting things in place to be able to understand how to support those individual needs. But actually, we're all different. We all have different preferences. We all have different ways of working. So if we can create an environment that supports all of us, and then there's some individuals who need very specific types of support, we can support them. But for the large majority, and to Pam's point earlier, that we're maybe seeing a lot more people coming through as neurodivergent, and that actually we can create an environment that is celebrating that, which I think would be good for all of us.
Anybody with any other thoughts to add, or anything that you feel that we haven't addressed?
I think just following on from Susie's comments, I think inclusion of all employees, including those with neurodiverse that are neurodiverse, does create a healthy culture, basically enabling employees to be confident in expressing different viewpoints. And also, I think it ultimately, for the right people in the right role, and I think that's really important that we have got the right people in the right roles, and identifying that earlier on, it produces more creative outputs, which is representative of and in tune with our society today. So I think it's just making sure we've got a full viewpoint, and actually a diverse workforce across the board is only going to benefit that, I think.
I don't know if it's worth just touching on late diagnosis or later diagnosis, because I think that's quite important as well, because we've got see situations where employees have been coping, managing situations where their children are neurodivergent, and sometimes that can be quite challenging for balancing employment with as well, because they might have to go and see consultants, they may have to get treatment, etc. So, but what's been quite interesting is there's quite a lot of the parents are then later finding out they're actually neurodivergent as well. So they're actually having to sort of not just cope with the children and the challenges that they may face at school as a result of the neurodivergent condition, but also then there's almost a realization they actually, perhaps their diagnosis explains why they haven't perhaps been fulfilled in the role that they're doing, or there might be challenges they're facing at work. And it's just thinking about the fact that actually some of these diagnoses comes quite late on. I've come across people that are in their sort of late 40s, 50s that are suddenly finding out they've got ADHD or some other neurodivergent condition, and they're having to come to terms with it. So again, it's just having that facility open to help them talk about it, and maybe, as I say, keep in mind it's not necessarily the neurodivergent condition that the employee might have, but actually it's them coping with children who may have challenges as a result of being neurodivergent as well.
Yeah, we do a lot of work with parents and carers and do awareness sessions, and I think employee resource groups can be really helpful for that kind of thing. So creating a network of individuals who can support and shared experience, is really valuable. So platforms like that can be really helpful for organisations to put in place to support their staff.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you all. I think we've covered a lot today. I think that there's obviously an awful lot more that we could probably cover, but I think for a period of time, I think we've got a lot in there. So if everybody's happy to draw an end to today, I'd say thank you all very much for joining, and thank you for sharing all of your knowledge and experience. Obviously, people can get in touch directly with you. I'm sure that all three of you have got contact details all found on LinkedIn, etc., or through the websites, which we'll share as well. So brilliant. Thank you all so much.